2017, and in that time, we've served over 50 companies. We've had close to 400 users come through, ranging from academia to startups, and then all the way up to people like Microsoft and Boeing. So running quite the gambit there of types of users, and a number of them have used the Clean Energy Fund. So looking forward to that.
All right. Thank you, Mike. How about Angela Becker-Dittman?
Sure. Hi, guys. Angela Becker-Dittman. I'm the Director of the Program Development Office for Energy and Environment at PNNL. I work out of the Seattle office, but of course, our main campus is in Richland, and we have offices and laboratories in Swim and Portland as well. PNNL, as you all know, we do about $270 million in federal R&D every year in the applied energy technology space, and have been very happy to partner with Commerce on a number of things over the years, from smart campus deployment to our pending grid storage launchpad. So just happy to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Eleanor, would you like to go next?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eleanor Bastian. I'm with the Washington Environmental Council and Washington Conservation Voters. I am the Climate and Clean Energy Policy Manager, which basically means in our organization that I help inform our campaigns and our strategic efforts with policy insight and policy development. So the last year I helped work on different clean fuel and clean vehicle technology in the legislature, and I spend the other half of my time right now on the Clean Energy Transformation Act rulemaking between all the agencies. So excited to be here and to learn more.
All right, thank you. Jarrett, you want to go next?
Hi there, yeah, Jared Sylvia, CEO of Blue Dot Photonics. Blue Dot is a spinoff from the University of Washington. We're about 1.5 years old now from a company standpoint. My co-founders are researchers from UW. I've been working closely with the Clean Energy Institute for the original discovery of the technology, but now we're looking to move towards commercial prototyping of our technology over the next year to 2 years.
All right. Excited to have you. And Aaron, I think you get to round it out.
Sure. I'm Aaron Fever. I'm the director of JC DREAM, which is the Joint Center for Deployment and Research in Earth Abundant Materials. Heck of an acronym. But we're a Washington State research center that's headquartered out of Washington State University, but we work closely with the UW and Pacific Northwest National Lab on critical materials issues at the nexus of clean energy and transportation technology spaces. So working to try to commercialize a lot of clean energy applications with Washington businesses. And prior to that, I was the chief technology and founder of a couple of reasonably successful startup companies in the area. One was Energy2, which developed carbon materials for battery applications and ultracapacitors, and was sold to BASF a few years back. And then the other is Group 14 Technologies, which focuses on lithium-ion materials. Those guys are up and running in Woodinville, just raised a big round of venture capital and are doing pilot scale development. So I continue to stay pretty involved with both of those companies.
Awesome, thank you, Aaron. And I think I said last, but Lindsay, I skipped you, didn't I?
Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm Lindsay McCormick. I'm representing the Clean Tech Alliance today. So we're a trade organization with over 1,000 members spanning 10 United States and I think 3 Canadian provinces. So the Clean Energy Fund is really important to a lot of our members. So happy to be part of this conversation today. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you all. Just so you know, also, as I mentioned, we have Liepa and Ilana in the background helping out, taking notes. We also, I'm not announcing her, but Melanie Roberts from PNNL is also on as an observer in case you see her name in there. And Melanie, I know you're an observer, but you're welcome to chime in anytime you like.
I'm her, I think she has to jump off a little later, so I'll jump in when she jumps.
All right.
Exactly.
And you should all know Melanie already. If you don't, you should get to know her. And so I will jump right into it. Let's get going. A little bit behind, but I think we're good. Like I said, I'm going to go through some of these kind of quickly. If people are confused, please just stop me. I do just want to set the scene a little bit. As I mentioned, you are now involved in a subcommittee of the Energy and Climate Policy Advisory Committee, the ECPAC, another good acronym. It was formed as part of the CETA law, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and with it, Commerce lead agency, it laid out exactly who would be part of what we are calling the executive committee, and I'll show you who that is. And then we had some discretion. We decided to break out some subcommittees to deal with the individual parts of the Clean Energy Fund. So this is one of those subcommittees, and we had some liberty to choose who we thought would be good representatives to get out there and give us some input on this. So that is you. So the advisory, that's what the advisory members were set to do, the executive members. I'll let you read that. But in general, what we're really trying to do is understand how our Clean Energy Fund, which if you don't know what it is, we'll talk about in a second, can be more effective, can run more efficiently, and how we can make sure all the stakeholders throughout the state understand its impact. All right, next slide. So this is the advisory committee. We've got Angela with us on our subcommittee today as well. She's part of the executive committee. Basically, if you notice, the law called for our research universities and all state level universities and PNL to be part of this committee. And luckily we were able to get everybody. So we have representatives from our state four-year state universities and PNL on board. Next slide, please. All right, Clean Energy Fund. I'm going to go real high level because I think you all pretty much know. Clean Energy Fund was started by Governor Inslee in his first term. We've had now 4 rounds of funding. So the state budget, this is a fund that's working to modernize the energy sector, opening new markets for clean energy and low carbon technology. It's a fund that's been funded now over the 4 tranches to over $150 million from our state capital budget. You can jump to the next slide too. From our state capital budget, it is we've given out about 100. We've given out about 150. There's actually about 170 million. We still have a 4th round that is still being distributed through a competitive process. So the purpose of the Clean Energy Fund in the state, and this is kind of the general language. I know a lot of you know about the Clean Energy Fund and have worked very closely with the Clean Energy Fund. Part of our exercise today is to understand the history a bit, but also kind of forget about the history. Look at what the law says we need to do and think about how we can do that most effectively and most efficiently. I will say there has always been talk about the Clean Energy Fund changing dramatically. We don't know what's going to happen. One of the issues we have, every 2 years, we have to go and fight through the capital budget to get this funded. And luckily, we've had Governor Inslee as our champion, so we've always been successful in doing it. But we don't know what the legislature is going to write every 2 years. It could look very different. This is our opportunity to get some input into those legislators as how it should look and what kind of things they should be focused on. I will also say, although I say we got to rethink this, I personally think what will probably happen, especially in this next round as it's coming forward, is that it will be pretty hard to fully rethink it at a legislative level. I would guess we're going to see something along the lines of what we've seen before. I don't know this, but this is just my personal bias that I will form. But so with that, we want to think about how we can take those traditional roles and expand them or make them more effective. So we'll get into that. So CEF funds in general must be used for projects that provide a benefit to the public through development, demonstration, and deployment of clean energy technologies that save energy and reduce energy cost, reduce harmful air emissions, or otherwise increase energy independence for the state. It's got some specifics in there. That's language that's been in all rounds of our Clean Energy Fund. It's got some specific areas to focus on, but it also gives us a lot of a wide breadth. And then it gives a little bit of what it's limited, it's may include but not limited to, has a pretty wide variety of technologies, and then it's got the kicker at the end, and new renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies, which is kind of, again, a catch-all. So that is the kind of the framework, and I sent you that document that has the language from the Clean Energy Fund, the legislative language that I'd like people to look at, because that's one of the things I want to talk about today. That language is what we have to work within. There's a lot of things around the Clean Energy Fund that have been put together through the bureaucracy of Commerce getting programs out, but the reality of what we need to stick to is what's written there in that law, and we have some flexibility within that as long as we stick to what's written in the law. All right, next slide. I'm probably going too slow here. Okay, I think I mentioned it's funded through the capital budget. One thing that has always been and will, I'm sure, continue to be, although it's something that we could make comments on, and I think we may later in another meeting, it may come up, but minimum 50-50 match is required. So CEF dollars can never pay for more than 50% of a project's capital costs. They must be competitively awarded, but that's really the only language. It does not set out what competitively awarded means. And it can be, anybody can apply for it, research institutions, nonprofits, for-profits. Really, the only thing they have to do is have the ability to work in Washington State, which is a fairly easy process. And then the project and the monies have to be spent in and stay in Washington State. Next slide. Here's the historical funding. About almost 40 million, or sorry, almost $32 million since the inception has gone into, okay, now I've switched out. Clean Energy Fund, I should have mentioned, has three main components that have traditionally been part of it. It also has a whole lot of other programs that are around the edges of it. The ECPAC committee is looking at the three main components. Those components are grants to nonprofit lenders. So grants that go to not-for-profit lending institutions around the state that are then turned into loan portfolios or loan programs that either are applicable to clean energy businesses or applicable to homeowners and businesses that want to do energy efficiency. Second pot is called our grid modernization pot. That is a pot of money that is focused on grid modernization, so the more efficient and smart way that we move our electricity around the state. Not so much generation, but how we move and utilize that energy most efficiently. That is a project can be applied for through our utilities. Only our utilities can go through that. Then there's a third pot. That third part is traditionally called the Research, Development, and Demonstration Fund. That is the pot that we are looking at today. We are calling it Innovation and Demonstration Fund, also a little bit to get out of that old concept of the RD&D, the Research, Development, and Demonstration Fund. But it is that we are looking at. That fund is what we are looking at here. So far, since its inception in 2013, we've put about $32 million into the Research, Development, and Demonstration Fund. That's been over four funding rounds, 4 tranches. You can see some of the monies there. The reason you only see 1-to-1 match on CF3 and 4, CF3 are just getting contracted right now, so I don't have all the match numbers, and CF4 has not even been released yet. So I just put the 1-to-1 matches. But in our first 2 rounds, especially round 2, we did get some significant leverage on our money, and that's always obviously important. All right, next slide. I should go with a little bit research, development, and demonstration. It has traditionally been the pot of money that is available to all participants in Washington State. So for-profits, nonprofits, research institutions, academic institutions. It is by far our most open pot of money. We have a lot of interest from anything from small 1 to 2 person startups, such as Jarrett's company, and all the way up to Microsoft, Siemens, DNL, UW, WSU, many organizations, and basically everybody in between. Traditionally, it has not been super focused, as you can see on the some of the portfolio companies. I will say I have often been a big proponent of it not being focused in order to kind of feel like the big tent of clean tech in our state can participate in it. But I will say part of this exercise now is, and we'll talk about, we have to align this better with some of the policies that are coming. So this fund in particular, I would say compared to the grid modernization fund that has been, I think, pretty well understood by the stakeholders, the utilities, well run within commerce, and people understand where it's kind of focused. This one, and they need to make sure they stay on the cutting edge of what grid tech or grid modernization looks like. This fund, I think, is one that needs a little more conceptual work on how we direct it to meet the goals that the state has policy-wise. This fund has been the least focused, again, as I mentioned, somewhat by design, but because of that lack of focus, it has been hard to, it's hard to tell the story of what a legislator or a stakeholder might get out of funding research and development. It just inherently does not provide a quick, tangible thing that a legislator can get their mind around. So that's been one area that's been hard to get to explain or maintain interest in. I would argue, though, that is an extremely important thing, and one thing we need to do is figure out how to make that case that innovation is crucial to what we are doing. The other side of it, though, is we now have policy. Clean Energy Fund happened in 2013. We didn't get policy, the policy drivers we really needed until, as you know, really this last session in a big way. So in a perfect world, we would have had policy, and then the Clean Energy Fund would have been established to execute on that policy. We got it a little bit reversed. So we've had this Clean Energy Fund doing amazing work. Now it's got some guiding light to it. It's got a policy that should guide its implementation, and we need to figure out how to align it. So grant portfolio, a lot in the grid and energy storage areas. I sent on that, one of the docs I sent has a little more description of the winners and all the winners in the past, and some of them have the money involved. Materials and recycling has been a big area of focus of winners, and then hydrokinetic energy has been very successful in it. I put some other notable awards, but anything from farming with Beta Hatch out in Wenatchee, composite and metal forming and shaping are some new awards that are very exciting. Fuel cells and data centers, we've been all across the spectrum for some really interesting projects. All right, next one. All right, so I'm going to take a break. And those were my slides, kind of giving some background and introduction to it. And then I really want to just get into the discussion. So,
question for you, Brian.
Yep, go Tony.
So this is Tony. I guess one of the questions I want to get a little bit of clarity on is the recommendations and ideas that emerged from this group. How much of that relates to the specifics of round 4, which is kind of, you know, a long way in the works right now, but we have specific language for round 4 versus anticipation of future pieces. If you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be helpful as we think this through.
Yeah, this is really for anticipation of future pieces. Clean Energy Fund 4 has been the RD&D round. Well, no, I'm sorry. Screw this up. Yes, this will affect the development of the proposals for Clean Energy Fund 4. So, and that's what you have the language for in that document, the actual the law language around that. So these recommendations will help Commerce think about that. Obviously, this proposal goes to the legislature and they've already passed Clean Energy Fund 4. So it probably won't affect the way the legislature looks at it, but it very well may affect our next round of RD&D funding through Clean Energy Fund 4. And a lot of that, I think, will come out in our second meeting. And I should have said that from the beginning. I think I did send it in the email. This is the first meeting, and we're going to focus on this specific question on alignment of policy, of the existing policy acts that we have. The second meeting is going to be focused more on the mechanics of how we should administer the kind of funds we have to best push forward innovation in our state, but kind of how we should actually, what our program should look like, how they should be administered. So kind of a little help on the bureaucratic program design side is kind of where meeting 2 is going to be. And then we will have a third meeting, which I didn't schedule yet because I want to see how this one goes and see if we have to rethink anything. But that third meeting is going to be around questions of equity, environmental justice, and kind of how we can push this, how we can kind of break the rural urban divide in some of this funding. So for your actual question, yes, it will help Department of Commerce with Clean Energy 4, just because they'll see these recommendations, but the real work is going to the actual report will go up to the legislature, which is really to inform future Clean Energy Fund rules. Long one. Anyone else have any questions about anything? And please feel free to tell me to explain things again. A lot of us, we talk about this a lot, so I may be glossing over very large things that folks aren't aware of. So if you ever hear me talk about things that just don't make sense, just jump in.
Hey, Brian, I have a question since you brought it up, including the clean tech group. Can you expand on that a little bit? So just looking at the people who've gotten it, I'll start by saying we love Psironix, and they use our lab and pay their bills and everything here. So nothing against them, but somebody, groups like them or Beta Hatch, what's the justification for including them in a clean energy fund?
Yeah, that's a good question. It came out of a part of that like big tent idea back in the day. I mean, I'll say, and Tony knows this better than I even, he was in charge of it, but their first round of clean energy funding, and this is interesting, especially for this group, the first round of CEF, the research, development, and demonstration, was specifically called out to go to universities or research institutions to match federal opportunities. It was back in the day of what's now the Manufacturing Institute out in Knoxville, Tennessee, called IACME. The state put a big proposal together to win that institute, and this was going to be earmarked to be the matching for that institute. We didn't win that institute, and of course, DOE took a long time to announce, much longer than they were supposed to. And so Tony had to scramble to get that money out, and that's where that kind of rethinking of it, of looking at that all went to private, he was able to find research institutions or public institutions to win those awards, but it created a rethinking, and the next round said, okay, it can also go to private industry. Basically, once it went to private industry, it was again kind of that big tent idea. We wanted to try to help. We didn't want to pick winners and losers, so we didn't want to say this can only be for companies looking at like advanced solar or battery technology, because I don't think we really knew if we would have enough cover that, and also we wanted to not be choosing the winners and losers in innovation. So we opened it up very wide, and we allowed people like a composite recycling technology center. Obviously, you could make a good argument why you should recycle in climate, but we allowed them to basically make an argument that lightweighting materials leads to energy efficiency in aircraft and transportation, and so that is an energy play. That's one example. Beta Hatch, I think too. I'm sure Beta Hatch, when I know we gave capital funding to help them build out their new bug growing manufacturing facility in Wenatchee. And I would bet a lot of that's going to like energy efficiency work within that building to bring down there. So that's how we justified those kind of awards. Those are probably the things that we need to not get rid of, but I mean, we need to focus this fund better. And some of those are good examples of ones that people kind of scratch their head, like Ceronics making cool cleaning new way of like cleaning oils and whatnot. I forget their exact thing. It's really interesting, but yeah, when people hear about it and then they hear the Clean Energy Fund, there's a little head scratching. So that is one of the challenges we have when we're trying to promote this kind of fund is how do we tell a story of where we're going with it? So that's why you all are here to help me figure out.
Brian, the other thing I'd add to that, being on the front end to design a lot of this, and then on the last review team for the last go around was, and I think it comes up probably in your next meeting. I think we have a lot to talk about the mechanics, because in the last round of the R&D funds, we had just south of 50 applicants. No, excuse me, just south of 60 applicants for it. And I was on the review team, the least technical of the folks on that review team, but it was an absolutely massive review process to go through. And, we could have each spent, several months of work time reviewing that if we wanted to go into the level of detail. So I think that's just a piece to put into the mix as we talk. How can we streamline the process and be as fair as possible to applicants and not overwhelming the review process.
Yeah, I would agree. That will be a huge part of next week's. I will say for this, I sent out, I want to say this is your all's group. I don't want to, I need to lead the conversation. I want you to tell me what you think. And with that too, obviously this one already came, but as I sent out some questions or some areas to talk about in the next 2 meetings, please feel free to add to that or say that I'm missing something or talk about a piece that you feel we need to address, because I want to make sure we address what this committee wants. And again, I am a big proponent of this is for us to listen to what you all think. And that's why I also, when I talk about opening up or not being too dragged down by the history of the program, because we're interested, we chose all you and this group because we're interested in what you think it could be as much as what it has been. So any other questions? Keep them coming. We actually do have some time, so we're not doing too badly. All right, clear as mud for everybody. All right. Okay, so this is it. And so this is really on you guys because we are going to have a discussion. You don't want to hear me talk this whole time. So I've got this question up here. We've got 3. It's a main question with 3 subsectors. We're going to take about 20 to 30 minutes on each one. And I will say, first sentence is kind of where it is. Most all the reports that you see, the work E2 has done for the state around, was it E2? Well, some of the reports that have been done by the state that look at pathways to decarbonization, most of the ones that look at pathways to decarbonization anywhere on Earth, all say that there is a gap there at some point in the future that innovation is going to have to fill. And so as we looked at the Clean Energy Fund, we tried to hit all aspects with our relatively limited amount of funding, but we wanted to help everything from the research and the development to the demonstration and on to the deployment of these technologies. So we're trying to hit the whole spectrum is how the idea of the formation was in the beginning. Obviously this RD&D is that one that is the most on the straight innovation side. And so how do we take our innovation funding, limited as it might be? It's on average about $7 to $8 million around, so $4 million a year, if you think of it that way. That's kind of traditionally how it's fallen out. When I say around, obviously our capital budget is an every 2-year process. So when we say $8 million went into the round, it's about $4 million a year. So now we need to figure out how we can align this innovation funding. Are you not taking everybody off the table? We don't. Again, I don't think it's necessarily, that's my opinion, it's a good idea to focus this too much. But we have some really bright guidelines now in CETA. I think people all know what CETA is, but it is our state is required to be 100% fossil free, like no fossil electrons on our grid by 2045. Completely carbon neutral by 2030 with trading credits, and then a whole lot of complicated rulemaking in between there. We also have our Clean Buildings Bill, which has not gotten probably as much attention as CETA, but I would argue is equally important in many ways. The kind of thing that draws people's attention to the clean buildings is it's any commercial or non-residential building in the state over 50,000 square feet, new builds as well as retrofits. That is very unusual nationally to go back and make all the existing buildings retrofit to the standard. It's an energy intensity standard. So with those two out there, how can we think about an innovation fund that tells a story? And they're not, these things might not, innovation might not have a laboratory and commercialized for another 15 years, but that's well within our time frame for addressing some of these policies. So how can we start today aligning CETA, or aligning with CETA, aligning with buildings, and we'll talk about other policies that we know we need eventually. So anybody have a great idea to start?
I'll just jump in if that's all right.
Yeah.
So I've been struggling with the same sort of thing with JC Dream. So I've only been the director of JC Dream for a year. We've got this broad, also a similar broad mandate to cover clean energy and transportation. So that already, at least that clears out the green buildings side from my perspective, but I can easily add that back in. But when I look at what I end up doing in that case is trying to look at it through the Washington State lens, and you guys are you're the Commerce Department, right? So I think it's important to view it through a lens of Washington State industry and business. And what I've been doing, so when I take clean energy and transportation in the JC Dream mandate, I look at, okay, sure, electrifying automotive applications, passenger vehicles, that's the biggest thing everybody is doing out, one of the biggest things that's being done out there. But we don't have anybody, we don't actually have industry players in the battery, the electric battery or electric vehicle battery sector. So large lithium ion battery companies don't exist in Washington State, other than a couple of them that I started, and they're still pretty small. We've got, and there's a hand, everything I say, I'm sure there are outliers. There are smaller activities going on, but we don't have a big contribution in the passenger vehicle sector. We're not part of the supply chain of the passenger vehicle sector in very many cases, but we have we're a force in aviation. We are a major player in marine industry. We're a major player with PACCAR. We're a major player in long and short haul trucks. And actually in logistics and shipping generally, again, back to the marine sector, probably also to Amazon, playing a major role in logistics and shipping, and just the ports of Seattle and the ports around the region make us a major shipping arena. Another area that's interesting is the cloud computing sector. So with the presence of Microsoft, Amazon, lesser Google and Facebook, we have massive positioning in that area, and that also are huge consumers of energy. They need renewables, they want storage, all of those kinds of things. So I tend to try to view, I tend to play to our strengths basically, and look at where Washington State is already doing really well, and where did those sectors need clean energy. And the green building one is also another one. That's another area where Washington State has some major influence nationally and globally. So those are the kinds of technologies then and business sectors that I would naturally focus on.
Awesome. And I'll hop in real quick and say, one thing I maybe should have talked about too a little bit that makes Clean Energy Fund interesting, the RD&D interesting, is it's RD&D, research, development, and demonstration. It's out of our capital fund. So these monies that we spend can be used for capital expenses. If you think of an R&D project, capital expenses probably aren't the first thing you're thinking about. So I wouldn't necessarily say take a capital fund and focus it on R&D. But that's the way. We could talk about it in another session, but there's very little chance this money's coming out of an operating budget in our state anytime soon. So it's probably going to stay in that capital budget. So with that idea is like, it probably leans towards being more effective in that demonstration realm, where you're working with some of these companies or in some of these sectors that Aaron talked about, and it's probably really good for getting the underlying infrastructure to help with the testing or the development of those things established in our state. So that is an area, as you think about it, remember, like, these are capital investments. So, and often they've been capital investments that live past, that may go to public institutions that make them available to everybody in the state, or they have some benefit to folks in the state. So something to keep in mind when you're thinking of this fund as innovation. It's kind of funding the capital requirements of innovation in the state.
So, Brian, I will follow up on Aaron's comments, which I think are very well taken, and use it as an opportunity to do a little soapbox here. And that is, I want to push and encourage us to strongly focus on the green building, clean building component of this. And I say that for several reasons. One is, of course, the clean buildings legislation, which is not unique, but unusual in the United States in terms of focusing on performance of existing buildings. The second piece that I think is important to cite legally is that the state also has a mandate with respect to energy codes in new buildings, so that by 2031, we essentially have to be close to net zero energy, maybe net zero carbon in our energy code, and make regular progress towards that. So I think there are two big underpinnings there from a policy perspective. And I think in both of those instances, there is a real challenge and a real need. If you look at the energy code side of activities, we've made a huge amount of progress in that space, but we're really beginning to get into an area of diminishing returns where the traditional cost effectiveness tests don't necessarily work going forward. So there's going to be a strong need for innovation in the green building environment writ large. Similarly with existing buildings, I mean, we know some things to do there, but in particular with a strong push by a number of entities in the Northwest towards building electrification. You've got a number of challenges there, particularly cost effectively displacing gas from space heating requirements. And then kind of finally in that space is it's a sweet spot for us. It's the big player in terms of building efficiency, in terms of green employment in the state. We have a solid 40-year record of demonstration, innovation in building sciences, from folks like, well, PNNL, certainly on the national level, but the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, the funding source for the utility to the market transformation, a whole bunch of that's been in the building space. I think that's really, if we want to focus in one area, I would argue that the building space is a really important one that would fit well with what's going on in Washington. Has a lot of local job implications, and also we have some opportunities in that space for disadvantaged and low-income populations in terms of state investments in things like net zero affordable housing over the last couple of years. So there's my soapbox.
Hey, this is Angela. If I could jump in violent agreement with Tony. I think if you think about efficiency, it checks a number of boxes in Washington State. The first of which is, you know, in the context of our clean energy and broader decarbonization goals, efficiency is the resource of first resort. Even more so because essentially what it does is shrink the size of the problem. And so it is, you know, a central pillar of any decarbonization strategy writ large. But also, Brian, to your question about how we leverage our state's, you know, unique strengths in data management and information technology, you know, the bleeding edge of energy efficiency R&D is really around the application of AI and machine learning to building controls. And I know a few folks on this committee participated in one form or another, or had colleagues participating in our Energy Storage Grand Challenge workshop a few weeks ago, and you heard Microsoft talk about the scale of the challenge with respect to data management and data center efficiency. Well, the forefront of efficiency achievement for data centers, which is notwithstanding the explosion in scale, have managed to sort of hold serve from an efficiency perspective over the past decade, which is a real success story, is really the application of AI and machine learning techniques to data center efficiency. So I think that, as I said, like, you know, to Tony's point, it's both important from a jobs creation perspective and also one of those areas where we have a rich track record and major players who are incredibly interested, plus, you know, the clean buildings legislation, which is a promising overlay and one of the few sort of pieces of legislation on the books nationwide that is beginning to move in the direction of, you know, performance-based standards for buildings. So I'll leave it there.
This is Jared.
Oh,
a couple thoughts. So I definitely want to echo the ideas of Angela, Tony, and Aaron around playing to our strength state. I think that is going to be beneficial in the long run. So, you know, be it IT, AI, aerospace, what have you, whatever our strengths are, whatever our local economic opportunities that we already have, we can capitalize on building on those. That would be prudent regardless. I think for me, there's always been a question with these funds, given how limited they are on an annual basis. As you think about R&D versus demonstration, where to best spend them? And that's kind of just more of a, what's the purpose of the fund at the end of the day? And I think as you start getting more tied to policy, it begins to make more sense to be much more focused on demonstration, unless you want to kind of flip the script. And Brian, I think you've had this in one of the documents that you sent us, is do we want to focus beyond what's already going to kind of be implemented by the market anyway, right? If there's a green market, you know, a green building initiative in the regulatory process going to be, you know, forcing innovation into the space, does the seed need to go towards that, or should they be more innovative, thinking about the next big problem, right? So focused on transportation, we're not addressing that. Should these funds start seeding the companies that might be able to do that? Should be looking at long duration energy storage, like seasonal storage, because as we think about 100%, you know, renewable electricity system, that becomes one of the big things we need to grapple with, is how do we maximize wind and solar power at different times of the year. Those are the bigger questions that I think, until we address what's the purpose, is this fund meant to augment and accelerate the existing policy, or is it meant to be looking ahead? Until we kind of have an answer to that question, I think it's hard to really say which direction should we then go to. But I think regardless, building on our strengths makes a lot of sense. But I'd like to have the broader discussion with the group of where they think these funds could be best used. More on the front end or more in the later stage deployment?
Yeah, and just for some context, because I think that was actually just something Jared and I were writing back and forth about, but that one of our questions, a good example in the space that Jared's in is, we have, so I told you I'm from the economic development side of this, and this is also the fund that most speaks to some of our economic development work in the state. And so a question we always struggle with is, like, we have a lot of opportunities and spend a lot of time looking to attract large manufacturers of cutting edge but traditional solar to our state. And we have some inherent reasons why we're at least in the conversation for a lot of those opportunities. But we also want to stay on the cutting edge. So instead of getting Q cells or name your large Canadian Solar or whatever, some manufacturer to come in and set up a big plant, which is great, provides us lots of jobs, how do we also encourage a company like Jarrett's to be able to scale up, or the work that Mike and Test Beds does around printed solar and whatnot? How do you make sure that those companies start here and then are able to have the chance of growing into major companies that provide us that next big thing? So we're not just fighting over companies that are placed other places just getting their manufacturing, but how do we grow our companies here and make sure we have a foothold in that next big thing? So that is something we think about a lot, and how to encourage it.
I'll jump in then, Brian. This is Eleanor. Again, I'm with Washington Environmental Council, so I don't have a technical degree or background. I work in policy and advocacy. And I'd say that to what Brian just said, of course, I absolutely understand the need for innovation and economic development and to remain competitive globally, and that this fund could serve that purpose. But really, to echo what Tony's saying, is that we passed these major laws. They've got teeth, but in the implementation, there are gaps. For example, with the Clean Energy Transformation Act, still a lot of wrangling to be done to get all of our utilities to really understand demand response and to embrace that in their model. So I think those kind of gaps that we see that everyone knew in writing the law, but that are playing out now and may will be crucial to how the law is implemented and how we achieve those goals. And I'd say just one more thing to add to the conversation is that we see the law as not only requiring utilities to meet those goals, but to do it in a way that achieves an equitable distribution of benefits. That's what the law states, and the UTC's discussion draft reflects that. And so I think there's a lot of jobs to be had in a more equitable distribution of benefits, sort of to what Tony's saying, deep retrofits and investments to make our own energy infrastructure a little more equitable. I think there's synergy there and support that we can do to implement the law. So appreciate this discussion.
Yes, and that should, Sarah Vorpal and I, just so everybody knows, Sarah was not able to join us, but she will just definitely join us for the equity piece. And that's our 20-minute warning on our first conversation, just so you know, 10 minutes left. There was some talk of having the equity piece first to overlay all these discussions. For other reasons, Sarah and I said we would do that on the third one, but that is an area that is crucial and super hard for me, and I think a lot of people, to wrap their heads around, is how do you take an innovation fund and make sure you're also addressing the equity issues that have become front and center. So happy to talk about it now too, but we're also going to have a whole session on that. So get ready. But again, talk about it now too. I'm not saying not to talk about it. Just want you to know we are going to, so think about it. Well,
so Brian, as we're thinking through this, and pick up a little bit on Eleanor's comment, I think one of the things to consider seriously, again, this gets a little bit into mechanics, is in addition to citing the language that is in the budget proviso, is really seeing where there are opportunities to build the selection criteria around specific provisions of the policy bills. In other words, how would your proposal, let's say we pick out, again, my soapbox on efficiency in buildings and green buildings, how would your proposal that you are making for this matching funds advance developments in efficient construction of new buildings, or in better performance of existing buildings, and how would it include provisions to ensure that there is an equitable demonstration, or that this would be located in areas that are have been adversely impacted by environmental degradation, those kinds of things. Building that explicitly into the selection criteria.
All right. You know, that's another thing I kind of mentioned in the beginning, and where I want you guys, even though a lot of ladies and gentlemen have been very involved in this, but like I said, when this first happened, it was only for research institutions, or and to match federal funds, very specific. And it's now broadened out to almost everybody. Like literally, if you're providing a non-state match, you can, and you have a technology that fits within our very wide window, you can participate. But that doesn't have, that is not written in law. That we could, just so you know, we could say this should go back to academic institutions. We could say this shouldn't go to academic institutions. We could, I mean, there is a pretty broad field, and that's where I challenge us all, and we're probably not going to do it on this call, but to think, especially for the next two, if you need to way outside the box. And another thing is, if folks know of things that work elsewhere, that is another area that we're interested in. In fact, Liepa, who's our intern who's on the call, she's doing some research into that now. Obviously, states with other 100% or close to mandates, and how they're maybe looking at innovation, but also maybe some federal programs, or even like impact investors, or those kind of programs. What kind of programs are out there that work? So that's something I want everybody to think about. We still have a couple more minutes. Anything else on?
One idea I was thinking about is just how do we measure success, and how do we look at the outcome? And I think that's one area where the policies can help guide. So we need to look at carbon. We need to look at CO2 reduction. We need to, in the clean buildings legislation, I don't know much about it. I'm assuming overall energy efficiency, or net zero energy are some of the kinds of metrics. So how do we maximize the impact of the projects that we have, and asking people to think big in those kinds of measures.
And I think that's a good one. I would also add on to that a little bit, is that especially as we look at giving this money to companies in our state, innovative companies, we have to be careful to remember that they're not basing their company on the Washington state market. If they are, they're in a lot of trouble. They've got to sell into the much larger market to be successful. Luckily now our state is a very good platform for probably testing the idea of some very cutting edge technologies. But that's just one wrench I always throw on the works, that when we talk about companies, we have to remember that Washington has its problems, but these problems might not get you a whole company if you just base just on our problems.
I had a question for Aaron and Mike and Jared in particular, and that is, you brought up, Brian, this idea of having access to state money in order to leverage. That was the premise of the first go around of R&D, was we were losing particularly federal Department of Energy dollars, because institutions in particular could not find the matching money to meet those kinds of requirements. is that still a significant issue that we should be aware of, or has the world changed enough that either academic institutions or private companies, if their ideas are good and well put together, can attract that kind of matching funding?
I'll chime in right now and say it's not a solved problem. From a small startup's perspective, that is something that it is still very hard to find that matching funds. The DOE still requires it for many of their projects. We have a project right now, a 20% cost share obligation, $250,000. We've been cobbling it together from various sources, but it's a little bit there. And for an early stage startup like ourselves, the venture or other private investors want to invest after the project is complete. They want to see the proof points of the technology. They don't want to see the idea. They want to see the proof. And so for us, it is still very much a challenge. And I think that's definitely a very powerful tool the state has to help attract those dollars.
I'd say the situation is even worse for academia. For the professors who are applying for federal grants that require funding, it's require cost share. I think there are even less options than Jared, and I think if there's a startup company, you have the potential to use in-kind cost share or even cash cost share in terms of wages, or if you have some investment or you've won some other awards along the way, just like money from state of clean tech. I don't know, I guess that's federal money, but this is the thing, is like in academia, most professors who would be applying for clean energy funds, they're doing so because they have no funds that can match federal money, because all their other grants are also federal dollars, whether it's DOE or NSF or DOD or wherever it's coming from. That's where the large pot of money is, and they don't have investors or salary that they can, their investment or salary that they can cost share for the most part. And then just one other practical thing, having annual or biannual calls makes it hard, because most of the DOE calls are published and then the due date's like 2 months later. And on the academic side, you need to be able to show that cost share to our Office of Sponsored Programs before they even let you submit the proposal. So it's still an issue.
And this is Melanie at PNNL, and even at a national lab, it's an issue. The DOE, awarded one grid storage launchpad, a $65 million project, and we were competing against other labs for that, and DOE cited the Clean Energy Fund matching awards as a major differentiating factor. So the matching funds are really helpful for bringing in those federal dollars for national labs as well.
Quickly second Mike's comment too about the timing, where if there's a desire to keep the cost share or federal fund matching aspect of this money, it needs to be more flexible and I think faster to align better with the actual funding call calendar of the federal organizations.
Yeah, and these are things we can talk about, especially in the next meeting as well. But the structure of our programs, like we have these RFP calls that we go out and have technical reviews. Again, we have other competitively awarded pots of money in our state that meet all the rules and stuff that are awarded on a rolling basis, or they don't have these dates. So those are the kind of ideas and whatnot that we're very open to. And I will say, another idea is things that I thought was, if you could focus, maybe you have a pot of money for private sector and a pot of money for academia, and try to split those out a little bit. But just for everybody's knowledge, that need for state matching to remain competitive for our institutions on a statewide or on a national level is crucial. Oregon has looked at copying our Clean Energy Fund specifically just for academic matches, because they're just, as many people have said, there's such a lack of matching. not only do they need the matching money just to apply, but there is no doubt that when a federal awardee or a federal opportunity sees that the state is involved with its own skin in the game, that is a big driver to help them win. This is the Clean Energy Fund. I said it's out of our budget. That's unusual for a lot of states. Very few states take their budget money and put it towards these kind of things. They might have other streams of revenue that they do, but like for it to come directly out of our budget like this is unique. So I don't think there's any doubt that, and also I would say, and this is probably Angela would back me up, and Mike, because they're part of it, like the success we've had with the grid storage launch pad, test beds, all these things, the success we've had by providing Clean Energy Fund awards to leverage up very significant federal opportunities has been something that I don't think gets enough credit. I don't think it's what legislators are getting excited enough about. So. And with that, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask, we can keep talking about this, but Alana, could you flip it to the next one just so we have another guide to talk about? Okay, so this is kind of that next level of, we obviously have some really strong guideposts in policy now, as we just talked about. But there's also some policy that we know we've fought for in our state for a while, or maybe we haven't, that we know probably going to need something along those lines to get us to our climate goals. Low carbon fuel standard or clean fuel standard is kind of the obvious one that's always been out there that we haven't gotten over the line. And transportation is is the largest portion of our carbon problem. So should we take this funding and say we are only going to focus it on policies we have on the books, or should we open it up wider? And it kind of gets to what Jared was saying, to make sure we're including those things we know we need, or making sure we're also addressing the future opportunities out there. So should we focus on current policy, or should we look at what we know we need in the future as well?
I'll make an argument that we should at least consider future policy. And the mechanism that I would recommend is that whatever comes out of this full process focuses particularly on the outcomes of the new state energy strategy. I think that provides a policy framework. And I think on the flip side, if you can say that one of the outcomes of the state energy strategy is it will help the state and Commerce focus, or at least propose where it wants to focus, actual state investments. I think you get double duty out of being able to do that. It won't inform this fourth round, I don't believe, of R&D, but I think moving forward in the future, if you can say one of the things we want to do, say in addition to buildings or in demand response research or something, is to say those areas that come out as particular high priority out of the state energy strategy process will also strongly inform where we would like R&D and D investments to head.
So Brian mentioned this with the last question, and the more we're talking now, even just switching to this question, the idea of, maybe it's not written in stone, maybe there's some sort of range, but separating the R&D and deployment, right? 2045 is not a long time away, and we need to start deploying solutions, and the people who are probably going to be doing that are not really anyway going to be the research institutions. They might be involved somehow, like there are professors involved in the Microsoft Fuel Cell Center down at McKinstry, but that's driven by Microsoft and the dollars they owe to bring in with their partners. But the RD&D is going to be more cutting edge, more experimental, but potentially vital, right, to whatever happens in the latter part of the approach to 2045, and it's stuff that we don't know about yet. So that's my short 2 cents there.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I think that when you think about how long technology development takes and where we're at with the kinds of solutions that are going to deliver us to 2045, we have to start right away. And that causes me to kind of broaden out the solution set a little bit. And I honestly, I think the example you're posing here, with low carbon fuels, is absolutely a crucial part of what's going to get us to those 2045 goals. I think it's actually already part of it's kind of written into the policy, but nobody quite knows that it's there. I think Boeing and aviation is again a phenomenal example of this. You think about, Boeing's cranking out, 777s and 787s and 737s of a specific design. They're gonna need jet fuel. Those planes are going to be flying around in 2045, the ones they're building right now. And they're not going to switch off of a completely different, you can't electrify aviation reasonably, and you can't even switch fuels easily in aviation. So the basic fundamental design of jetliners is not going to change in 10 years, maybe a little bit, but it's really going to require, fuel. And again, back to the industries that I talked about, I think marine is in the same boat, pardon the pun, and long haul trucks can't really very well be electrified easily either. So, and then you pair all of those points with the fact that Washington State and the Northwest in general has some of the lowest electricity prices in the world. And we're actually in a really unique spot to harness that energy and create fuel from it. And it's something that it will have to happen in order to be successful in being our 2045 policy goals. So actually an area that I've to realize is going to be really important. Hydrogen economy is kind of in with that. It's you can take a lot of the excess energy or low cost energy and use it to create low carbon natural gas and use existing infrastructure. So there's all of these fuel alternatives that are probably going to be a really important part of hitting the targets that we're aiming for.
So good. I have a couple things to add here to what others have said. I think the real advantage of the low carbon fuel standard from my perspective is that it forces the higher carbon transportation fuel providers, the refiners, to actually pay for lower carbon fuel. So, having to use the CEF to try to drive that innovation is not going to be as effective as getting the refiners to have to make the choice to do it or pay for someone else to do it. And I'd also just say, from my perspective, the refiners will continue to have complete control over the transportation fuel markets for the most part, except for electrification, until we have a real policy in place. That's the last 100 years of history, that's how we power most duty vehicles and almost all medium and heavy duty vehicles. So I would want the investments in biofuels to be really generating innovation and transportation fuels. And I think that's a high order until you have a policy in place. I think to what people said before, though investments in transportation electrification connect to all the other things we're talking about with clean buildings and improving the grid and innovation. So just wanted to point out that transportation fuels, there's always going to be a gorilla in the room there.
Yeah, and it gets, it gets interesting too when you're trying to fund, especially I'll take clean fuels. If you're trying to be on the innovative side of it, you're not going to be demonstrating renewable diesel. You're not going to, and then you get probably way on the outside. A lot of us went through the old algae days and things like that. But legislatively, not in trouble, but sometimes if you go a little too outside and where people really don't understand or don't see any path forward in the immediate future, you get yourself in a bit of trouble. So yeah, some of those, like I do think electrification, because it's a more wide open field, lends to itself better to maybe some of the demonstration, where I agree liquid fuels is just a very complex issue. And then maybe it's up to the person putting in the application to really make a strong point why their liquid fuel idea truly is revolutionary and or innovative. And maybe that's what we need to do, is just hold people like, okay, you're going to tell me that this liquid fuel, you better have a really high bar to get over to show that this is innovative or is really going to change things in a period of time that's reasonable. I don't know how to do it, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brian. This is Jared. I think there's a couple thoughts that have come to mind. I think the first one for me is the overarching idea of pushing on the innovation side is critically important, because that's a big gap in the current funding journey for any new technology. And, as we've all recognized, 2045 is not actually that far away. And so there's going to need to be a lot of innovation to achieve all of these goals. And what's already, the goals that aren't laid out already, right, around transportation, et cetera. So I think the innovation has to be key. I think the alignment with the state policies in place, though, is critical, to your point, just to continue to get the full stakeholder buy-in, both the voters and the people in Olympia, who to justify the decisions they made around the capital budget, et cetera. So I think, in the mechanics discussion that we can have later, discussing how to make sure the application is able to show that and reflect that more clearly as part of the application process is probably going to be important. So we should make sure to include that in the next discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. And when he kind of mentioned that, I mentioned already, if you have other topics that we should be addressing in the future ones, please let me know. The other thing is, we're taking notes here. I'm taking notes. AP is taking notes. This will, the commerce folks that put these programs together will see these in all their full glory. Legislature will see recommendations that, not watered down, but it'll go through our process of putting a legislative report together. So, but when you think about like commerce saying this, if you have real specific points that you want to say in your words and you don't want me to translate or something, please, anytime in this process, email me them and I will make sure to use your language and get certain points across. And as we do this as a committee, obviously we'll get some notes out there and stuff, and we'll probably get to an area in our last one where we really focus in on what we want to highlight as most important. So just putting that out for everybody. I guess that, or what are those gaps that, the low carbon fuel standard is so easy, that gap is, are there some other gaps people can think about that we just know that we're going to have to address to get to this, our climate goals, but there's no policy in the near future that's going to address it? And is that a good place to focus some of this work?
Question there, Brian, is agriculture a topic at all in any of the current policy?
Yeah, well, I put that at the third. Yes, that specifically, at least internally to commerce, there has been a lot of interest in, especially, I will say there's an east-west divide in our state, obviously. A lot of these monies, it's pretty widespread, but there's some focus. We want to get some focus on rural communities and projects in certain districts on the east side, quite frankly, help politically often. And the agricultural area, that is one of those things. Our state is top whatever you want to call it, in top 3 in many aspects of the agricultural world. It's a huge driver of our economy. And from a climate perspective, there are huge gains to be made. That then we're trying to focus this back on energy, and then that opens it back up to things that are energy related, but maybe not as directly and are more climate or environment related. But yes, we are going to talk about agriculture, especially in the 3rd round, but any ideas right now would be great as well.
This is Melanie. One issue, the policies are about decarbonization in Washington state. And there are certain innovations that we might have here, that we might come up with here, that do not reduce our own carbon emissions that much, or, you know, for manufacturing, if it's an intensive manufacturing process, may even raise them a little bit here to create technologies that would lower the overall, you know, emissions across the globe and also provide economic benefit to the state. So I don't know how you're thinking about those kind of projects where it's not a, you know, in-state carbon reduction benefit, but it's maybe more of a global one and an economic opportunity.
Yeah, that kind of gets back to the Washington state's not going to be your market if you're starting a company. But I do think we have to be cognizant of at least having a story. I mean, I think a great idea is a great idea, but I do think we need to think about having a story of why this is somewhat related to the state or somewhat helping us get to some goals. We have not traditionally done a lot to fully exclude people, which might be a problem. We always have left a little wiggle room for people to put in an application that might be on the boundaries, on the edges. That's good, but it's also created problems, as Tony mentioned, in just sheer amount and diversity of opportunities we've seen or applications we've seen. So yeah, that's a balancing act of how do we cut down, how do we get this narrowed down with a more of a laser focus to kind of help call the kind of applications we get in, but also how do we make sure that this is innovation? And this is what I will say, not scares me a little bit, but that we're going to come out of this pandemic. There's going to be so much need to get people back to work immediately, and dollars to fill things like that, put people right back to work, getting insulation in houses, doing things that we can put people back to work. And we need to do all that. We've economic development, energy, everybody's focusing their efforts on those. I do have a personal fear that we have to make sure we don't lose sight of the innovation. Like, these probably are not going to bring about 500 new employees in the next 3 years. These things, they're probably going to take a little bit longer to have that kind of impact. But I do think we need to be careful to make sure that we are making that strong argument why some relatively small portion of the money does need to stay involved in true innovation.
So another area, again, lacking any legislative or policy support, but something that very likely could be a big deal down the road, is just CO2 capture, sequestration, reuse, circular economy around CO2. That's obvious. If we're successful by 2045, there's no doubt that that's going to be part of the picture.
And I'll mention the legislature did unanimously pass that industrial symbiosis bill in the last session, but the governor had to veto because of budget constraints. So that was the sense of the legislature, that they're interested in that area.
Yeah, and we are seeing, it's interesting, in BC, you've got a big direct air capture contingent, or big, and a couple of companies looking at it. We've got some popping up in the state that are looking more at capturing flue gases and whatnot. So it is an area that is getting a lot more traction than I've seen in years past, and we've got some interesting companies looking at different aspects of it around.
And when you talk about innovation, Brian, and that, having having been the innovator and watching how long it takes these technologies to come to fruition, I don't know. I don't really know what you do about the policy side other than, you know, there's certain things we can do within the state, but on the innovation side, oftentimes you do have to take a risk and lean into something that you think is going to be important, and hope that you have the right technology at the right time, because it's the most valuable when things actually do change. And I think the good thing is I think we're poised for that change in the policy to happen relatively quickly, but it also may very well not. So it's tough. I guess we have to recognize that if you want to be innovative, there's just risk associated with that. That you put a bet on a technology that didn't pan out. You know, when I first got into clean energy, I went into the hydrogen economy and wanted to do hydrogen storage materials back in 2001 or 2003, and that was the wrong thing for that time. The funny thing is, it may be the right thing for now, 15 years later, but you never quite know, I guess is the point. So we have to be a little bit willing to accept risk if we want to lean into innovation.
In terms of
second everything Aaron just said.
So in terms of areas to look at as we're putting this together, and again, this may be more, but I think there's at least a supposition that the nature of the built environment may have to change significantly in the era of coronavirus and potential other pandemics. So, you know, is that something we want to include in here, where you're developing innovative air handling technologies for buildings, or you're redesigning the nature of the built environment to respond to social distancing or those kinds of things, where people will be putting likely a lot of time and effort to think that through, and a lot of innovation. What are the implications and opportunities in the energy space for that, either in terms of efficiency or using non-fossil sources for the energy to supply those kinds of technologies?
Yeah, thank you. You know, and going back what Aaron and Mike talking about, that taking risks, it's one of the things that we all, I mean, in the beginning of this, it was riskier. Tony went through it a lot, but I mean, yeah, we were taking risk, and with the Clean Energy Fund inherently, and there have been failures. There have been companies that won money that couldn't accept it all, companies that have won money, did accept it all, and are no longer in business. We have been lucky or good so far about being able to talk about our failures successfully. Avista has a very good project that is a known kind of failure that, I guess that just gets to some extent the story. Like we have to, I think commerce has to get comfortable with accepting that risk. And then we probably need to get better at the story we tell to the legislature, to the stakeholders of why we accepted that risk and why it was a good thing to accept that risk.
We don't have any cylinders, Ryan?
Not that you or anybody else knows about.
Oh, all right, good.
No, we don't. I mean, yeah, we haven't had spectacular blowups, and part of that is it's not a huge fund, and that's where the other thing I think we should keep in mind is part of this is really to sprinkle relatively small amounts of funding in to hopefully get much larger investment back into the state.
I think the good thing we've got going for us is we are phenomenal state for innovation and entrepreneurship, and have been for 100 years or something like that. You know, you look to the types of companies that are successful in this area, and the list goes on and on and on, both big and small companies. And so I think it's refining, you know, it's a story you got to tell, and you got to get good at telling that story. But I think it's something that you can convince everybody in the state just by talking about, you know, Starbucks and Amazon and Boeing and Microsoft and everybody else that defines our economy. That's how what we're doing is we're taking a little bit of a risk in the hopes that we create a new one of those down the road. And that really is, when we talk about energy, we're talking about the biggest thing in the world from an economic standpoint. And so to the extent that you create one of the next big energy behemoths, and that's our next Boeing, Microsoft, or Amazon, or Starbucks, right? So I think, you know, we gotta get good at that pitch, I guess, because it is a pitch.
This brings me to a thought. Well, other people jump in. I will throw one thing out there. Should we even consider this money when we get an application from Microsoft or Siemens? I won't include the academic and research institutions because that's different, obviously. But there is some thought that, like, why are we giving money to Microsoft? Like, they really need $1 million from the state. At the same time, some of those projects have been very good in bringing together other partners and bringing a significant focus on the work going on in the state because who's involved in it. And also, it's not necessarily bad to have a little piece of partnership with some of our major companies. But I would like people's opinion on that. Should it be size limited? Should we really focus on small, innovative companies, or should we leave it open to the whole breadth of companies?
Don't tell Dan Schwartz I said this, or maybe you would agree with me, but I say leave it open. You know, it shouldn't just be going to small companies and academic institutions. That's, you know, my take. You know, using Microsoft as an example, the facility down in McKinstry, you know, it allowed for multiple corporations, including some that, you know, otherwise wouldn't be working on innovation in the state of Washington, to come in and partner on that. It has been a place for multiple PhD students working in engineering, the College of Engineering, to go and learn about, you know, how they're trying to solve this massive energy problem with data centers, and, you know, it created a talent pipeline in that regard. I mean, I think I don't think you can discount that. I also would imagine that the large match and then that we can show for CEF2 probably has a lot to do with the partners that Microsoft and the investment Microsoft made themselves in it. And, you know, large companies have a lot of money, sure, but that group at Microsoft probably doesn't do that without this money from the state. So, you know, just using that as an example, you know, I don't think all the money should go to corporates. They're far from it. But, you know, I think it is, good things have come out of it. It's you know, I would say it's probably one of the better stories. You know, so if you have people questioning about failures, you can point to that one as potential success that's still going. But then also from a political sort of sustainability buy-in, you know, it's not just the Washington State Department of Commerce trying to do crazy stuff with a small amount of money. It's, you know, got the support, you know, from big corporations like Siemens and Microsoft that see the value in the small amount of money that can make a real change for them.
And just so people are aware, we have attempted in previous rounds, not on this pot of money, with the grid modernization money, in an effort to get, in that case, smaller utilities that are less able to do some of this, try to get them into the So, and that's, so we did some things to incentivize smaller utilities. So we could look within the leave it open, but look within the program design to maybe have pots of money that give you get some extra credit if you're a small company, or maybe there's a pot set aside for academia and research. And so within the pot, we can think of ways to incentivize different groups while still leaving it open too.
So one thing I agree with a lot of what you said, Mike, but I also, I don't know. I'll just declare my bias. I'm a startup entrepreneur, and I believe strongly that small companies innovate much more aggressively and successfully generally. I'm not saying big companies aren't a major source of innovation, because they are, but I feel like stuff moves quicker at small companies. But at the same time, I just rattled off why Washington is so successful, and it's a bunch of companies that are really big now, and playing to that, I think, is important. So this is an idea that maybe helps, Brian, when you talk about trying to narrow the field of who wins these things and what kind of proposals do we accept. Maybe a thought is that we ask for really robust, solid collaboration from the Boeings and Microsofts and Amazons, and we ask them for matching funds or in-kind contribution as their participation in the project, but in return we insist that the project clearly benefits them and helps to deliver solutions that are going to affect their bottom line. And I think that actually ends up being really good for small organizations, because I know that startup companies will be like so wrapped up in how good their idea is, and they're like, yeah, I know that Microsoft is going to want to buy this, but they're wrong, because they haven't really talked to Microsoft enough, and they haven't engaged Microsoft enough to know that they're close, but they're not quite right. And so maybe forcing that collaboration, it narrows the field a bit. But maybe that's where we line up small company and maybe university, researcher that are going to deliver a novel solution, and a potential customer comes along with it, AKA PACCAR, Boeing, Microsoft, utility companies that are not traditionally as effective at innovating their own solutions. So I don't know. That's just a thought.
I totally agree, Aaron. I didn't mean to diminish the role of startup innovators, and I think you're right to do faster. But if a corporate wants to take the steps to try to innovate, and I also wouldn't have spoken, I guess, so glowingly about that specific project if there wasn't a role for researchers and innovators in it, like the groups from the College of Engineering participating. If it was just Microsoft and Cummins and Eaton, playing around in Soto, probably wouldn't think of it as highly. Right?
Couple thoughts too, just so everybody knows. Or actually, Aaron, let me make sure I understand you. What you're thinking is that leave it open to the big guys, but require the big guys to bring a small partner on board that they're interested in. Is that kind of along the lines, or make sure there's a small company involved in the overall award?
Yeah, I think it's frequently it's something that you see as a little bit of a recipe for success with federal grants as well. They love to see private sector, national lab, and university researchers generally, and then I think they also like to see small startup companies and big players, and maybe throw in the universities or national labs as with all of their research capability and technology and equipment and resources. And those end up being the kinds of, I don't know, that's been my experience with the federal grants that win. It's a collaborative approach that lines up a variety of different players, and that also does good things for our the political side of this, and you can if Boeing or Microsoft like it, then a lot of people across the state are going to say, yeah, okay, that's probably a good idea. And then if you've got also WSU or University of Washington, PNNL, and a startup company involved, then you've got support across a wide variety of folks. And also, I think that is a recipe for successful innovation. Because in my background, I have done it wrong. I've done cut brand new research and starting up a company around it, and have it missing the mark a little bit because there wasn't enough conversation going on with the customers. And the customers oftentimes are bigger companies. They're the people that are, deploying these technologies. So if you have that new startup company, you've got, a Washington State company or your Washington State player as the customer or the advocate for that technology, then you probably have technology that's pretty close to the mark, or at least they're very interested in it. And if they're going to put some of their money into it, or even if they're just going to put their time into it, they think it's a good idea, they're probably going to stick with it. And those are the things that are, I think, more likely to be successful in the end. And if they aren't successful, at least you can go back and say, well, look, we had all these people thought this was a good idea at the time. And so, yeah, I guess it didn't quite pan out the way we wanted it to, but it looked pretty good at the time. Rather than if you just have one company or one researcher or one startup company that thinks it's a good idea, that's riskier. And it's riskier politically. It's also riskier from a technology innovation standpoint.
Yeah, I completely agree, Aaron. Strong innovation ecosystems come when all the pieces are collaborating. That's how you spot the opportunities for innovation and make sure that all the pieces are there, including the investment and the customer and people in places of power that can help to, attract more investment from other places. So, I think if you have your selection criteria that are based on what is the public value for Washington taxpayers, and, how do you reduce energy equity and or increase energy equity, and various other criteria, if it meets those, and especially if it promotes collaboration between the different pieces of the innovation ecosystem, it's very strong. It will really help the state to grow the sector and our impact.
Yeah, I agree with Melanie's point wholeheartedly about creating the ecosystem as being really important to de-risk these projects and to make them be as potentially impactful as possible. So from that point, I think it's the selection criteria and the way the application is crafted. So I think it comes down to the mechanism discussion to encourage those type of teams to form, maybe not require them, but encourage them and, make sure the applicants know it'd be really good to go get Microsoft or Boeing on board if you can. We won't, completely ignore your application if you don't. That can be a hard conversation to have, but it should be definitely a feather in your cap when it comes to evaluating the project. And then at the same time, I think if the innovation criteria are high enough, having Microsoft with McKinsey come together and do a project with a few researchers who may not be a startup company, if it's a really innovative project and they're looking to help de-risk it financially with CEF funds, that should probably be okay as well, as long as it's, at that innovation hurdle.
Yeah. Well, one thing just that all brings up, the Grid Modernization Fund is a pretty good example, and one reason it's probably been somewhat successful is that it's the utilities that win the money, and then they put together teams of innovative companies to address problems they have. And that's been a pretty successful model, and I think it's been pretty successful for some of our small innovative companies. So that's one area where we are doing that, we'll look to. My draconian time management went out the window. I realized we only have 8 minutes left now. So quick, Alana, to the next one. Okay, and this is a little bit along the agricultural discussion we had. The other aspect that has been interesting within the Clean Energy Fund, a lot of this comes from that need to fund capital expenses. Our OFM, our state budget, or money people have so far said information technology, software and things like that are not capital expenses. So we've had a lot of trouble funding opportunities in a place where our state is extremely strong. So this is kind of asking what are ways to maybe help with some of the IT work, knowing how crucial it is to some of, like we were talking about earlier, AI and machine learning for buildings is crucial to meeting those targets and things. How can we be looking at bringing in those technologies? And then those other obvious strengths of our state that we could do better in. I think agriculture is one we'll talk about later. But yeah, so if anybody has any ideas on what kind of information technology we should focus on or how we might think about bringing, it gets tough because it's really a capital funding issue. But I'd be interested in areas that you see opportunities to help the information technology side of this.
More considered capital. I guess I don't quite follow, especially in the current day and age where everything is done in an IT system and nothing's done in a physical asset with the COVID outbreak. How we can't justify that IT is actually becoming a capital asset.
Yeah, and Tony might be able to speak to this better. I think one aspect is maybe we just need to challenge internally that thought, and maybe there is ways to break for. From what I understand, the way we as a state define our capital investment is asked to have a 13-year lifespan. They've extended that, like for instance, LED light bulbs can now be included because their lifespan theoretically can last that long and whatnot. So we have worked things in to be capital expenses, but straight IT, there has just been a pushback on it. And Tony, I don't know if you have any further.
Sure. So fundamentally, and I'm not a capital budget expert, but fundamentally the question comes down to this comes out of the capital budget rather than the operating budget. And the money for the capital budget comes out of bonds issued by the state. And you can see in the provisos in there, it's the construction bonding, it's the, whatever type of bonding source is used. And in those bond issues, the way the underwriting of those issues is around physical assets. And so they're sold along those terms, and that's why OFM. So it isn't really an arbitrary aspect in that regard, but they sell them as capital bonds as opposed to operating bonds. So if there were, bonds that were sold for the purpose of operating expenses, they would have different terms and conditions, but those would be under a different part of the budget process. So I think the program has funded IT activities and other things, but only really as an integral part of you are designing a large widget for $2 million. And as part of that widget, of course, you have AI or IT aspects related to it that is integral to that piece, then it would qualify to be, covered by this, much as when you're building a building, the architectural design and those kinds of things, which aren't, physical, you're paying for that, qualify as integral to the process. But being able to say, we have a new app that would save this large amount of money, and it is really nothing more than the $500,000 we need for the IT expertise to develop that app. I don't see how you can fit it in under this. So I hope that clarifies.
Got it. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah.
And the other thing we've done with projects that do have a significant IT thing that we can't fund is that 50-50 match. They find a way to use their match to pay for the IT related work, whatnot, and our match to apply for the capital infrastructure.
Can you pay for things like supercomputer nodes and modeling? I mean, because you need processing power in many cases to do AI, to do advanced materials modeling, all of that. It requires massive computing power, but I don't know that those probably don't have a 13-year life.
No, those would. The 13-year life gets into if it can exist for 13 years. I mean, I think everybody knows that a terminal might not be very good in 13 years, but it's still a capital piece of equipment. So I'm pretty sure we do pay for those sorts of things. So yeah, like, and a lot of what's been successful in the clean energy and the RD&D program is companies basically building out, using the capital funds to build out lab space. For instance, on a project, here's a project. It's from A to B. To get that project, we have all these operational expenses, but we have all these capital expenses. We need upgrades to our electrical infrastructure at our laboratory. We need some new air handling system. We need capital infrastructure, or we need testing equipment to pull this off. And so they've done that. And then they have a laboratory, or they have equipment that can be used past the life of the project that we funded. So yeah, those kind of things, the infrastructure needed to do the work is applicable. And with that, we have 2 minutes left. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. If people are real passionate about something, I can stick around for at least another hour. I don't think we're going to do that. But otherwise, I had a 10-minute wrap up. I don't really have much as a wrap up other than to say, I would love your input on how this went. If it wasn't worth your time, let's make sure the next meeting is worth your time. So any ideas on how it could be better, I'd appreciate. And like I said, any areas that I think I've sent everybody all the questions that I'm looking at, but I'd love input on how to make those better or do them differently. And then, yeah, if you, like I said, if you have some things that you weren't able to say or something you'd like to get on paper so it's real clear, just email me anytime and call me anytime. I think everybody's got my cell phone number, but anytime, and I will probably answer. I'll get back to you if I.
Brian, it'd be helpful prior to the next meeting if you could send around the notes from this discussion, just to kind of see, what crazy things. I want to know what crazy things I said and what they sounded like, but also give us a little bit more time to reflect prior to the next meeting.
Yes, that is a good idea. All right, that's what I intend to do. I will caveat that I don't want to be, but we've been furloughed, so I don't. Not allowed to work on. Yeah, I'm not allowed to work on Monday. So I will, but yeah, I'll get it to you, and hopefully in plenty of time before that next meeting to do some reviewing. And I would like your input on that. Obviously, Lepa and I are taking notes, but maybe we misinterpreted or you want it said some other way. So please mark up those notes when you do get them out to you.
There's also, on a related side note, if anyone would like the link to the recording of this meeting to review before next time, we can also share the link for that with you as well. You can email us about that.
Can we wait till it comes out on Netflix?
Yeah, it'll probably be on tomorrow, I think.
Oh, okay.
You're going to be the next Tiger King, Tony.
All right. Brian, I will want to follow up on you on those fellowship things. So if you want to send me times that work for you to just do a Zoom talk, let me know.
Yeah, sure. And people, if folks need to get going, please get going. Tony, if you wanted the stage to give your pitch real quick.
Oh, yeah, I just want to say, I mentioned I'm working with the University of Washington. The University of Washington Clean Energy Institute, as Mike probably well knows, has received money from the Tollefson Foundation to establish to allow some graduate students in the PhD program to work on energy policy for organizations, about a 20-hour plus kind of stipend to work on that. I'm looking for folks that have opportunities for folks to do very focused policy analysis, essentially, for them. My first preference, of course, are public entities like the legislature or local governments. Legislature probably doesn't work given they already have a system. But if you have any needs in that space, or you know of any institutions or organizations in Washington that might have an interest in there, please shoot me an email, tusabelli@gmail.com.
Yep. And if you forget that, you can always talk to me and I can always get a hold of you.
I can send around a note to everybody with a little bit more information.
Yeah, I should. Yeah, please do. And I should say your email, everybody's on an email chain now. So Also, if you want to continue the discussion or bring anything up over email before the meetings, and you want to send to the group, that's great too.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, appreciate everybody.